you guys time to sit down and get set up.
Oh, okay.
Cool. Okay. Could somebody shut the door in the back? Thank you very much. Okay, again, both seated and ready to go. So Representative Klein, we would welcome your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here today to discuss H.R. 7511, the Laken Riley Act. Less than 2 weeks ago, Laken Riley, an avid runner, went for her morning jog around the Lake Herrick Trail in Athens, Georgia. When she didn't return home, her roommate called the police, fearing the worst. Authorities soon found her body in a wooded area just off the running trail with her skull crushed. Just last Friday, Laken's parents laid their daughter to rest, their lives forever altered by the senseless and depraved actions of a criminal. After Laken's alleged murderer, Jose Ibarra, illegally crossed the southwest border in 2022, the Biden administration released him, paroling him into the country rather than detaining him as required by law. Later, this illegal alien was arrested in New York for endangering a child and driving without a license. There, too, police released him, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement did not arrest or detain him. Mere months before Laken's murder, Ibarra was again arrested in Georgia on shoplifting charges. But again, he was quickly released by police, and ICE did not arrest or detain him. But when Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas was asked whether this criminal alien should have been deported, he merely stated that his agency, quote, works closely, end quote, with law enforcement to ensure individuals who pose a threat to public safety are considered the highest priority for detention and removal. What the Secretary conveniently didn't mention is that at his direction, as laid out in a September 30th, 2021 memo to DHS employees, ICE cannot prioritize for removal criminal aliens like Jose Ibarra until after they commit a serious crime. The truth is, under President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas' lax immigration enforcement policies, even if local authorities in Georgia and New York had turned Ibarra over to ICE, Ibarra would not have been a priority for immigration enforcement, and it's unlikely that he would have been arrested, detained, or removed by ICE based on the crimes he committed. Today, we are considering the Laken Riley Act to change that. H.R. 7511 requires the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to take into custody illegal aliens who have been charged with, arrested for, or convicted of theft offenses as Laken Riley's alleged murderer was. This legislation mandates that ICE detain such aliens until they can be removed from the country. H.R. 7511 further requires DHS to issue a detainer for these illegal aliens and take custody of them, quote, effectively and expeditiously. Through a detainer, ICE requests cooperation from local law enforcement to ensure that ICE can take custody of the alien when the alien is released by local authorities. H.R. 7511 also ensures that states have standing to bring civil actions against open borders executive branch officials who refuse to enforce the nation's immigration laws. I want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Bishop and Mr. Roy, for their work on H.R. 7322, the Sue for Immigration Enforcement Act, which represents a critical component of this legislation. By releasing Laken Riley's alleged killer into the United States in 2022, the Biden administration violated the parole and detention requirements in existing immigration laws. While H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act, as passed by the House, would ensure that the Biden administration could no longer abuse the law in this way, H.R. 7511 adds another layer of protection to make sure that immigration laws are followed. The Laken Riley Act provides states standing to bring a civil action against federal officials for the failure to enforce several immigration statutes, including mandatory detention requirements at the border, case-by-case parole authority, and visa sanctions against countries that refuse to accept the return of their nationals who have been ordered removed. In so doing, H.R. 7511 responds to the Supreme Court's 2023 ruling in U.S. v. Texas, in which the court held that states did not have standing to challenge the Biden administration's open borders immigration enforcement policies. Standing provisions of the Laken Riley Act follow the roadmap set forth in the court's holding by specifically authorizing suits against the executive branch brought by a narrowly defined set of plaintiffs, the states, and authorizing the judiciary to enter appropriate orders. As such, this legislation will ensure that harmful abuses of our immigration laws, in fact, those policies set forth by the Biden administration that are in direct conflict with the plain meaning of our current laws, will not go unchallenged. H.R. 7511 also honors Laken Riley's life and her positive impact on her community. It includes a sense of Congress that our nation mourns the devastating loss of Laken and all other victims of the Biden border crisis. The bill urges the president to denounce his failed policies and re-implement the effective border security measures that he dismantled upon entering office. No law passed by this body can bring Laken back or take away the pain suffered by her family and countless other victims of criminal alien crime. The Laken Riley Act, however, will ensure that illegal aliens who committed theft offenses, as Laken's alleged murderer did, cannot be shielded by the lax immigration enforcement policies of the Biden administration. The Laken Riley Act also provides a much-needed avenue to hold Open Borders executive branch officials accountable for violating the immigration laws to the detriment of American citizens. How many more bills named after victims of illegal alien crime must the House consider before Democrats and the Biden administration act to secure our borders and prevent other senseless tragedies like this one? Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Nadler, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to start by expressing my deepest condolences to Laken Riley's family. The pain of losing a child is something no parent should have to go through. The alleged perpetrator should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. By all accounts, Laken was a kind and gentle soul, beloved by everyone around her. May her memory be a blessing. Unfortunately, instead of coming together to express our sorrow for Laken's tragic loss, the majority appears to be exploiting her death for yet another partisan political stunt. Rather than approaching this tragic event in a thoughtful manner, Republicans appear to have just thrown together language from existing unrelated bills that target and scapegoat immigrants to score cheap political points in an election year, while doing nothing to address the situation at the border. This approach is fundamentally unserious. As if to emphasize the point, the author of this legislation spent the weekend promoting anti-Semitic memes on Twitter. At base, this bill is a rinse and repeat of the majority's unserious attempt to keep immigration in the news. Pick a crime, paste it into a template bill with sweeping, unrealistic immigration consequences. Then require detention and deportation of certain immigrants merely accused of committing such a crime. No due process required. All so that you can demonize immigrants and sound tough without actually making this country safer. The legislation before us today would subject to mandatory detention any undocumented immigrants merely arrested or charged with committing an act of theft, larceny, or shoplifting, along with those who are convicted or who admit to committing such acts. Let's think about that. Someone who is arrested, who was never charged with a crime, is now going to be subject to mandatory immigration detention? The case of Laken Riley is a tragedy, but as is often said, hard cases make bad law. Under this bill, committing a misdemeanor shoplifting, or even committing no crime at all, can result in a DACA or TPS recipient, someone who may have been in this country for decades, being subject to mandatory detention. Sadly, there are countless real-life examples of people getting arrested because of mistaken identity, through erroneous witness identification, biographical similarities to perpetrators, and errors caused by faulty facial recognition technology. In a markup we had in the Judiciary Committee last month, Mr. Massey discussed how mistaken identification can deprive someone of their constitutional rights. He noted very real concerns about racial disparities in the development of artificial intelligence and facial recognition tools. These tools have led to numerous erroneous arrests, mostly of people of color. For example, just over a year ago, a Detroit woman was arrested for robbery and carjacking after she was improperly identified as the perpetrator by an automatic facial recognition search. She was 8 months pregnant when she was arrested. After being held by the police for 11 hours, she was released on a $100,000 bond. It took a month and 2 hearings for the case against her to be dismissed. Under this bill, however, if this woman had been on DACA or TPS status, ICE would have been required to detain her upon her release, and her U.S. citizen son would have been born in immigration detention, even though she committed no crime. Mandatory detention of innocent people is not a reasonable or sensible policy choice. This is not where we should be focusing our limited enforcement resources. It is important to remember that this bill would subject more people to mandatory detention at a time when Republicans refuse to give the Department of Homeland Security the resources it needs to carry out its policies. The Biden administration is currently detaining 39,000 people a day. This is 5,000 more people than Congress has even provided funding for it to detain. Congress has never appropriated, and no administration has ever requested, sufficient resources to detain all non-citizens who fall under the mandatory detention categories. Even former President Trump never tried to detain all migrants subject to mandatory detention. House Republicans know this, but instead of facing that reality and providing the resources necessary to address weaknesses in the immigration system, they would prefer to demagogue the issue, and they bring us measures like this. If that weren't bad enough, this bill also purports to give state attorneys general standing to sue in court for perceived violations of certain sections of the Immigration and Nationality Act, hoping to convince the judicial branch to impose the draconian immigration policy preferences that MAGA Republicans have failed to get through the political branches of the federal government. This bill simply declares that states have standing to sue so long as the state or its residents suffer almost any degree of harm, no matter how trivial, appearing only to exclude financial harms that are less than $100. And we should note that this provision is almost certainly unconstitutional. Just declaring that there is standing does not make it so. Just last year, the Supreme Court addressed the issue of states standing to sue the federal government over immigration enforcement matters, which this bill appears to be a half-baked attempt to circumvent. In an 8-1 decision, the court held that Texas and Louisiana lacked Article III standing to bring suit against the federal government over its alleged violation of some of the very same immigration statutes that this bill would purport to grant standing to the states to sue over. In rejecting the state's standing argument, the court noted, among other things, that lawsuits alleging insufficient arrests or prosecution run against the executive branch's Article II authority to enforce the law, which includes the discretion to determine enforcement priorities in the face of lack of resources and shifting public safety and public welfare needs. This bill also goes directly against the Supreme Court's settled precedent in Spokio, Inc. versus Robbins, which explicitly states that a statutory right to sue does not constitute an injury for purposes of standing. But settled precedent, much like responsible governance, doesn't seem to matter much to the majority. Time and again, Republicans have refused to engage in bipartisan immigration reform. At the behest of Donald Trump, Republicans dismissed out of hand a bipartisan Senate border bill that Senate Minority Leader McConnell called the strongest border bill in 30 years. In October, the Biden administration sent Congress a supplemental funding request, which included an additional $14 billion for border security. House Republicans refused to schedule a vote on this funding request, which would provide the Biden administration the resources it needs to secure the border and would provide additional support for communities receiving migrants. Both these bills would have allowed the Biden administration to hire thousands more asylum officers and immigration judges, so asylum hearings happen in weeks, not years. This would help put an end to what my Republican colleagues refer to as catch and release, a procedure in immigration law that has been used by every administration for decades. All they can point to is H.R. 2, which last week got a grand total of 32 yes votes in the Senate when it was brought up for a vote. Instead of rushing yet another partisan stunt to the floor, the majority should work with Democrats to pass bipartisan solutions to address the situation at the border. That would be a far better way to truly honor the lives of those we have tragically lost. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Chair has no questions at this time, but I'll turn to my good friend, distinguished Chair, Dr. Burgess, for any questions he might have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to ask Mr. Klein if he would care to respond to any of the observations of the ranking member.
I thank the gentleman. To respond on the issue of detention. The aliens to which the bill applies are already inadmissible for being in the country illegally and can already be detained. In fact, the aliens Biden releases at the border, including Laken Riley's alleged killer, are already subject to mandatory detention under immigration laws, which the Biden administration ignores to mass catch and release illegal aliens into the United States. I would start with that, and I'd be happy to answer any further questions.
Well, it just seems like, we employ people, Department of Homeland Security, that are supposed to be in charge of these investigations and preventing these types of things from happening. And the only reason I bring it up is I was contacted by a constituent who is an HSI investigator and normally works in cybersecurity. But for 3 months out of last year, he was redeployed to San Diego to work as a babysitter for these numbers of people that are brought in. He goes through, described to me in elaborate detail what goes on in the various pods and medical screenings, et cetera, but that's not his job. And we employ him, we pay him very well to be an investigator to determine, is there someone in this country who's not supposed to be here, and remedy the problem. And it's just so frustrating that we can't seem to do that. As far as the Senate bill, we never obviously got a version of that over here, but for crying out loud, this problem is not an immigration reform problem. This is a border security problem. I don't know how many times I have to say it. I don't know how many different ways I have to say it. This is not an immigration reform problem. It is up to us to provide the necessary tools and resources to secure the border, and we need a president who's willing to do the job, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman, distinguished ranking members, recognized for any questions you may have.
Well, yeah, let me just say to my colleague on the Rules Committee, the gentleman from Texas, the Senate bill was a border security bill, and I'm happy to send him a copy over so he can review it. And it was this House that essentially killed it when Donald Trump called the Speaker and said, I don't want a solution, I'd rather have the issue in a campaign. The cynicism that surrounds this topic is appalling, and this bill falls into that category. I unfortunately I'm going to handle this rule tomorrow on the floor, so I'll have a lot more to say. But let me just ask both of you. Did this bill that is before us have a hearing in the Judiciary Committee?
It did not.
Is that correct, Mr. Klein?
I would say that I believe that part of the bill, some of the issues in the bill were addressed at an earlier hearing, but this bill specifically did not.
Yeah, I think some of the, you reported a bill out on, I think, on the standing issue, but none of this other stuff has been, had a hearing. So there was no markup either, right? So no one had an opportunity to amend it?
No markup.
Was it reported out of, was there a vote to report it out of Judiciary?
No.
Yeah, and can I ask, like, why, if this is important, I mean, do we not believe in regular order around here, or what's going on?
Okay. We did mark up the standing language.
Right, but there's a whole nother part of this bill that's pretty significant, which had no hearing and no markup, no opportunity for amendments. And I don't understand, we're not doing anything of any consequence in this House. I don't understand why the Judiciary Committee couldn't meet and have a hearing on this bill, allow Democrats and Republicans to offer amendments, because, I think if this is a serious attempt and not just a cynical exploitation of a terrible tragedy, and you actually wanted to move this thing so that it might have a chance in the Senate and it might be sent to the President's desk, that you would seem to me you would follow regular order. I'm just trying to understand, is this just a press release? Is this just following Donald Trump's mandate to keep to exploit the issue and not find a solution? I don't, again, why do we have committees around here if we're not going to have at least the appearance of regular order? Look, this is not a solution. This is a ploy to exploit a terrible tragedy, and it really sickens me that that's the route we're going here. But nonetheless, there seems to be a number of people on the other side that they wake up every day and they try to think of these things. Driving wedges in our society, not solving this problem, And Mr. Nadler talked about the lack of resources to actually detain people. And there have been numerous requests and numerous attempts to try to provide more resources. And so the idea that we're asking the administration to do more, to detain more, and we're not even providing them the resources to detain the people that right now they have in custody seems to me to be, again, to be appalling. Look, this young woman who was killed was 22 years old. As I said at the beginning, my daughter is 22 years old. My heart aches for their family. This is a terrible tragedy. And if we were actually serious around here, we would have approached this issue quite differently. You would have had a hearing. You would have had a markup. There would have been an attempt to try to win bipartisan support. There would have been an attempt to engage the administration more seriously. But we're not doing serious work around here. I'll have more to say on the floor tomorrow, but I yield back my time.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for any questions she may have for the panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I do have to take exception with the ploy to exploit tragedy and the political gain. And there have been many of us talking about securing the border for months, for years. And to say that just now we've started talking about it is ridiculous. HR 2 was passed off our floor last year. And so we have been talking about this, and we've been trying to tell people or express what will happen and the dangers that is going on, that is being allowed with this border open. And so I take issue with being told that it's some kind of political ploy. But I appreciate this bill because it's about respecting the rule of law, and that it works for both aliens entering our country and the Biden administration tasked with protecting it. So, I suspect the Riley case was caught the suspect in the Riley case was caught not once, but twice in committing crimes and had an active warrant out for his arrest for failing to come to courts for his crime. And that's the kinds of things that we want to make sure that we are preventing and now and into the future, and what we've been talking about. What we have been talking about for years, for at least a year now. So I appreciate that this bill is actually moving towards making sure that we are securing the borders and helping keep our citizens safe. So with that, I yield back, and I thank you for the bill, Mr. Klein.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for any questions she may have for the panel.
Thank you. Anyone with a heart, should be mourning the loss, the death of Laken Riley, a promising young woman whose entire life should be ahead of her, a life of love and laughter and service and friendship. She sounds like she was a remarkable young woman. Instead, her family, her friends, and the wider community are left to deal with the pain and loss of her senseless death, and we should all be offering condolences and comfort to her family and friends. But that's not what is happening here today. Instead, our Republican colleagues have seized upon this tragedy and are exploiting this young woman's name and her family's pain in a heartless and grotesque political charade. Talk is cheap, but legislating is hard, and one party here is not interested in legislating. They're interested in political ploys, in messaging bills. Over the past 4 months, House Republicans have said no to funding for border security, no to funding for DHS and immigration judges, no to funding for Border Patrol, and no to funding for ICE. And House Republicans have said no to a bipartisan bill to address and fund border security that passed the Senate with a huge majority. This bill would do none of that. And this bill would do nothing that would have prevented the murder of the young woman whose name is being exploited here. There are ready-made solutions that Republicans could call up right now for a vote if they cared to. But they don't want to fix our broken immigration system. They want to use it as a campaign issue. So to end as I started, anyone with a heart could see how grotesque it is to exploit a murder victim and her loved ones this way. This is a nauseating new low for House Republican majority. I yield back.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Mr. Klein, I want to thank you for representing the Laken Riley bill here today. This could have been named after any one of hundreds of people, unfortunately. This is not a singular occurrence. It is named after one person, but unfortunately, this happens every day in the United States. And these other countries, they're emptying their prisons. They are sending people out of the country. They're taking care of a problem and creating problems here. And it's, the president says there's nothing he can do about it. That is just a big lie, unfortunately. But to anybody who believes that there's nothing he can do about it, here's a bill that gives us even more tools to do something about it. And one death is too many. And unfortunately, this bill isn't just about one death, but it's about trying to prevent the needless deaths, not just deaths, but also all the violent crime, the petty crime, all of the crime that's going on because we have an open border and no control over it. And unfortunately, it seems like with this administration, no desire to do anything about it. So I want to thank you for bringing the Laken Riley Act before our committee today, and I'd urge adoption of a rule for this, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for any questions she may have of the panel.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. A few weeks ago, I stood with my colleagues on the House floor. I stood and I listened, and I thought it was appropriate to stand and grieve and listen to the pain. Like our ranking member, my children are the same age, 25 and 23, my three children in college. And so it is hard to hear of the loss of somebody so promising. And it is proper that we recognize that pain. And we have so much of that pain across this country. So often I have stood on the floor of the House and myself stood up to recognize those we have lost. In that instance, it was for a mass killing where numerous guns were used, automatic weapons. I've stood with friends of mine as their constituents were lost to natural disasters, to other mass murders. And it is our job to look at these horrific events and say, what can we do? And so I recognize that urge to try to do something in the face of loss. But like, I think that the important thing to do is to be careful about what we do and to do it in a thoughtful manner and to do so in a way that recognizes what can be done and what will be effective. I am struck by the fact that this bill has no funding, and I'm struck by the fact that ranking member pointed out that we already have policies for detention, but we don't fund the Homeland Security so that there would be enough detention. I'm struck by the fact that you could get arrested for any kind of misdemeanor and would face that detention, whether or not you were ever charged or not, and by the testimony with regards to what does that mean for people's civil liberties. I'm struck by the fact that there was a border bill. Ranking member, was the Senate bipartisan legislation, would you describe that as something intended to address issues at the border?
It was certainly intended to address the problems at the border. That was its purpose. Most of the Republicans who talked about an open border voted for it. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump, former President Trump, said in so many words, and our colleague, Mr. Nels, said in so many words that that bill shouldn't be adopted by the House because it would solve the problem, and we don't want to solve the problem. We want an election issue, not a solution to the problem. And that's why that bill hasn't been taken up yet.
Yes, so it strikes me that those who care a lot about this issue would be supportive of bringing bipartisan solutions and working together across the aisle on bipartisan solutions.
It is a bipartisan bill. It's a very harsh bill, frankly. I'm not sure I would vote for it.
Yeah.
It's a very harsh bill, and more harsh than the bill that was last considered by the so-called Gang of Eight in 2013, which is 11 years ago, which is the last serious attempt to deal with this problem. As I said, that was the last serious attempt to deal with this problem until this bill, and of course, what we see from our Republican colleagues, not all of them, because some of them
In the
in the
House,
Senate.
I mean, Republicans in the Senate described it as one of the strongest border bills that they
Yes,
had
they did.
always worked on.
And what we see from our colleagues in the House is that they'd rather have the issue than a very, in my opinion, very harsh, in the Republican senators' description, very strong border bill.
So Trump said, do not take up that bill because it will not be good for my reelection. And so instead of addressing the issues at the border, by actually taking up the bill and looking at what things we could do over here, it was, as our speaker said, dead on arrival. I also want to, Mr. Chair, seek unanimous consent to enter into the record an article called "The Truth About Illegal Immigration and Crime."
Without objection.
And, you know, as we look at this covers numerous studies that show that actual immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, actually have lower rates of crime because they are very concerned about not threatening their ability to stay in this country. So, you know, I'd encourage my colleagues to review this. And this man deserves to have the harshest penalties available as he's convicted. And I think that that is key, and that is also possible. There is nothing in the present law that will prevent that. There is nothing in the present law that will prevent his deportation, as I understand it, as he is convicted. And so I think that that's something that's important to remember. Ranking Member Nadler.
That's correct. I just want to point out, in light of what you were just talking about, a study from Stanford last year, Stanford University pointed out that the last time immigrants had a higher incarceration rate than native-born Americans, than native-born citizens, was 1870. Today, immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than native-born citizens. Between 1990 and 2013, the undocumented immigration population more than tripled from 3.5 to 11.2 million, but FBI data indicates that the violent crime rate declined 48% in that period.
And if they are convicted, they are deportable. Is that correct, Mr.
Absolutely. If they're convicted, they are deported.
And they should be.
The problem with this bill, with a number of bills that we've seen, is that an arrest or a charge gets someone put in permanent detention. Even an arrest when no one is ever charged. And that's just un-American.
Well, once again, I do believe that the perpetrator deserves to face the consequences and under our laws. And I am very saddened by this loss of life. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Klein, I appreciate you representing, telling us about this. You know, what's been talked about, the previous bill that was bipartisan, it wasn't an immigration bill. It was just, to allow 5,000 a day equates to 1.8 million allowed in this country. To have clauses that the president can basically declare any of it null and void. So this is just a messaging bill. the HR 2 that has been sitting in the Senate is the real, did something about it. And I guess, my colleagues on the other aisle, I think the parents of Laken Riley will be at the State of the Union. Take some of your comments to them. Let's see how that works out. Take some of your comments to Kate Stiley, who was gunned down. I think she was 22 years old. Take some of your comments to, the number of fentanyl deaths. Mr. Klein, does this bill even affect any of those who have been killed by fentanyl poisoning under this administration?
This bill specifically deals with those who are charged with theft, petty larceny. And so HR 2 would have addressed in a much broader way the problem that illegal immigration is causing in this country. And the Senate bill, to my knowledge, for all of the talk of the House not wanting or not wanting to take it up, the Senate bill didn't pass the Senate. The Senate bill is still in the Senate. So the House has acted. The House has debated this issue for over a year. The House is, and the House passed HR 2.
So this administration is doing this purposely. They're doing it for a reason. And let's look at some of the numbers. On fentanyl alone, there are no treatment centers in morgues, as has been said by others. Here are the numbers under the Biden administration on fentanyl deaths alone. 2021, 70,601. 2022, 73,654. 2023, 112,000. The total during the Biden years of fentanyl deaths, 258,255 Americans are dead. Compare that with the combat deaths in the Korean War, 33,686, Vietnam War, 47,434, Afghan conflict, 1910, Iraq, 3,519, Lebanon, 256, First Gulf War, 149, for a total of 86,854 deaths of these 6 wars. You have more deaths from fentanyl due to this administration opening the borders up, discontinuing the wall. And, this is the blood is on this administration's hands. And I guess make your argument to the family of one person when you can be multiplied by the 250-some thousand that are dead now. So it's really an embarrassment to say this is being grandstanded. Tell that to the family. See how
Would the
how they
gentleman yield
react.
for a question?
Sure.
Were you aware that the fend-off fentanyl bill is part of the national security package that passed the Senate?
What national security package that had any real teeth to it? Name me one.
Well, so the national security package that passed the Senate included the fend-off fentanyl bill, which would address many of the issues you say you have regarding fentanyl. But that's the bill that House Republicans don't want to take up, correct?
The bill does not get the job done. It's the words that you're saying are just simply words, Ms. Gallion. I mean, you know this. The numbers don't lie, and the deaths that are now, forget the fact that we're under a national security risk. Forget
I can't
what's coming
forget that.
down.
That's why we need to pass the Senate bill, which includes funding to fight fentanyl.
The funding is not the case. Let the Border Patrol agents do their job. The Democrats are using this as a ruse to try to dupe the American people into believing this was really something. I can't say that letting a million, hold my time, I can't say that letting 1,825,000 illegals, 5,000 a day, you call that a realistic immigration bill?
That's
It's
actually not what the bill said.
Is it not 5,000 a day?
No, that was a trigger for when the border would close.
But they had
But we
the
can
right
get to
to
the
let
language.
5,000. Well, let me just say this, Mr. Klein, reclaiming my time. None of these numbers, the American people, they don't buy what the Democrats are pushing. This is a direct result of an open border, letting over 160 countries put their worst in America. And it's a crying shame that it's allowed to continue. And it's done for one reason, to maintain power. And it's sickening. Thank you, Mr. Klein. I appreciate you bringing this up. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from Texas, recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Thank the chairman. Mr. Klein, this bill is named after Laken Riley, correct?
Correct.
Who tragically was killed about, 11 days ago?
Correct.
Student at Augusta University, right, I think, who was going for a jog 11 days ago. Now she's no longer here. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
She was killed by somebody who was released into the United States under mass parole under the Biden policies through El Paso. Is that what you understand?
That's my understanding.
Current law requires parole to be on a case-by-case basis. Is that what you understand?
That's what the law says.
And yet this administration is using parole to mass release people into the United States, resulting in the death of an American citizen, at least this one, Laken Riley, in Georgia. Is that what you understand?
This is the most recent one, yes.
Could this bill also have been named, for example, after any number of other individuals, particularly, for example, the 2-year-old who was killed here in Montgomery County, Maryland, who was also killed by somebody who was released on mass parole from an individual from Venezuela?
It could have.
Or perhaps the individual who was raped in Louisiana, a minor who was raped in Louisiana by somebody who was released, a Honduran?
Yes, sir.
Or perhaps we could go back in time. How about Kayla Hamilton, a 20-year-old with autism in Aberdeen, Maryland, with her boyfriend, a 17-year-old illegal alien from El Salvador who appeared at the border in March 2022, an unaccompanied alien minor, and was released into the country to a sponsor. The suspect lived near Kayla, where he would later rape her and beat her to death in her home in July of 2022, less than 2 years ago. A young woman with autism. Authorities later found out that the assailant was a documented MS-13 gang member from El Salvador who was arrested in 2020 for associating with the gang. Does that seem to be a situation in which our border is secure? Is that somebody that maybe perhaps should not have been released into the United States?
Tragically, that's correct.
How about Aiden Clark in Ohio, a 10-year-old boy, 35-year-old illegal alien from Haiti who was released into the country, common theme here, in August of 2022, was struck when he struck a school bus full of children, resulting in the bus flipping and ejecting Aiden, killing him. It's a 10-year-old boy. Another result of the policies of this administration and their open border policies, but more importantly, their release policies of releasing individuals into the United States with spurious understanding of our ability to know whether they've committed crimes, and when we do, still releasing them often. Would the gentleman agree?
I would agree.
Or how about Elizabeth Medina, who was who was murdered by someone released under the Obama administration? A victim on December 5th, 2023. Elizabeth Medina, a 16-year-old high school student who was a part of the cheerleading team, was found dead in her bathtub in Edna, Texas, by her mother. Her mother found her 16-year-old daughter dead in a bathtub in their home. She was supposed to perform in a local Christmas parade with her cheer squad, but never showed up where her mother went looking for her. Can you imagine?
No, I can't.
The suspect, Rafael Romero, was charged with Elizabeth's murder, a 23-year-old illegal alien who was overstaying his visa for the past 5 years. Another person in the United States unlawfully, because of this administration's and the previous Democratic administration's failures to enforce the law. I could keep going. Example after example of individuals. 10-year-old boy killed in a hit-and-run incident in Midland, Texas, caused by an illegal alien that had been deported 5 separate times. I don't want to hear any more about Cato studies. I don't want to hear any more about, who commits more crimes or less crime, fewer crimes. What I want to hear about is whether someone is supposed to be in this country in the first place, and whether those individuals, when they're in this country, released into this country, particularly knowing that they've been committing crimes or affiliated with gangs or affiliated with dangerous criminal organizations are released in the United States and then conduct crimes that kill Americans. Does the gentleman from Virginia agree?
I do agree, Mr. Chairman.
With respect to the Senate bill that we've heard so much about, is the gentleman from Virginia under the perception that the gentleman from Texas, myself, is somehow beholden to the former president of the United States, President Trump?
No.
Is there any indication in the news that he is beholden to the former president of the United States?
No, Mr. Chairman.
The reason I point that out is the bill that the former president opposed in the Senate is a bill worthy of opposition because the bill would not have done the job. And the former president is correct. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I assume the gentleman from Virginia would agree, but it's important for the record to reflect that that bill would not have accomplished the job, and in fact would have made it worse. And that is why it was opposed before it even came to the House. People want to say, well, somehow House conservatives who killed that bill. Well, I wish I had that magic wand because there's a lot of bills I'd like to kill by just blinking at it. But this bill was killed in the Senate. I'm not even sure, remember what the vote was? It wasn't very close. The bill died in the Senate. Now, why might it have died in the Senate? Here's the question I would have. Would this bill have fixed? Let's just focus on the issue of parole. Let's just focus on parole, not the rest of the bill, not the utter nonsense about this bill would have done something in terms of increased funding that we know would have been used to process more people or somehow would have dealt with fentanyl. The fact is parole. This bill would not have fixed parole, the Senate bill, because as I understand that bill, it would have simply continued to allow parole to be awarded en masse to people through ports of entry and included mass exceptions to what you could do to even that rule. In other words, it wouldn't have touched parole. So the very mechanism that has been used to parole these individuals, the very mechanism used to parole the man who came into this country, was released, went to New York, engaged in some behavior or is engaging with police there, then left and went to Georgia, killed Laken Riley. It was under parole that the Senate bill would not have fixed. Is that the gentleman's understanding?
It's my understanding that the bill would have codified the misuse of parole authority that's currently the policy of this administration.
It is also the gentleman's understanding that it would have provided attorneys for people who are here illegally? Is it also the gentleman's understanding that that legislation would have codified mass releases in the form of what we casually refer to alternatives to detention?
That's my understanding.
Because what I think the average American probably is under the misunderstanding, if they listen to the words uttered by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, that somehow the Senate bill would have had this magic ability to fix the glitch that magically just started going on steroids somehow in January of 2021, just totally coincidentally. That we would have had, with respect to the entirety of all of the releases into this country, right? We know that asylum wouldn't have been fixed under the Senate bill. We know that parole wouldn't have been fixed under the Senate bill. We know that lawyers would have been provided. NGOs would have received upwards of, I don't know, $1.4 billion, $2 billion, $2.5 billion, something like that dollars for NGOs to continue to process people. $4 billion for allegedly for asylum officers to process claims with a requirement they be processed in 180 days, which we know would have been a rubber stamp for asylum claims, when in fact the average American believes, as I started to say a minute ago, that people are detained. That if someone comes to this country, as the law says, you are to be detained. That a claim is then processed by somebody for a legitimate claim of persecution for your religious or political beliefs. It is detained, it is then determined, and then you are either returned home or allowed to be in the United States temporarily while we sort out your claim. Is that what the gentleman understands is what the current law should be and what most average Americans think it is? But the truth is, under the Biden administration, people are being released en masse into the United States under parole and asylum and other avenues.
That's my understanding.
So now we have the legislation before us, named after Laken, that would do two things. One, The second part, which has gone before committee, is a part that would give standing to states to be able to go into court and to say, hey, we have a situation where law's not being enforced and we're being harmed by it. Well, let me ask you a question. If you're the parent of Laken Riley, do you think there's a harm?
Absolutely.
If you're the attorney general or the governor of the state of Georgia, do you think there's been a harm to one of the citizens that you represent?
Absolutely.
And do you think in the absence of enforcement of the law by the federal government that it should be incumbent upon the governor and the attorney general of that state in Georgia to be able to go into court to say that the laws of the books, the federal laws, should be enforced?
Yes, sir.
The other provision is a provision to require that when there are certain crimes, I don't have the list in front of me, theft, burglary, and other crimes, that those crimes that are currently largely being ignored or not reported, or if they're reported, there's not a detainer attached to it, this would require that a detainer be attached, correct?
Correct.
Now, again, for the complaint that I've heard about, well, it might just be an arrest, that's un-American, we're talking about people here who came to the United States and were released into the United States under color of a claim to asylum or under some expansive use of parole, released into the United States, i.e. you're a guest. You are a guest under the benefit of the privileges of being here in this country. And you get arrested. You get arrested. Now, there's due process under our Constitution for someone who's here, who's a non-American citizen. Due process in terms of the arrest and the crime. Do you have a right to not have a detainer placed on you when you came into the United States and you're seeking asylum or seeking a benefit when you come to the United States?
No.
You do not. All we're trying to do in this legislation, it ain't rocket science. It ain't a 1,000-page bill filled with, I don't know, $12.7 billion of earmarks. Sorry, I think I just slipped into another bill in another category of debate. It is a short bill designed to try to help the American people, try to give some sort of semblance of order to our country when the American people have had it, and had it with a Congress that refuses to do its job to check an executive which is lawless and out of control, and that Americans are dying as a result of it, namely Ms. Riley from Georgia. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for any questions she may have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Klein and Representative Nadler, thanks for coming to testify here today. Certainly appreciate your time. I just want to start by saying I cannot imagine how Laken Riley's family is feeling right now. As a mother of 3 children, one of whom is in college, this is something that resonates with me on a very personal level. It's beyond tragic, and I know that many of us in this room feel the same way on both sides of the aisle. Many of us are parents. I think the most tragic part of this case is that it was preventable in nature. It could have been avoided. There are real consequences to the policies that this administration has adopted at our southern border. And what's crystal clear is that there is something that we can do, certainly, to try to address cases like Laken's. There are actions that we can and are taking, even in the face of this administration's failure at the southern border and the bad policies that they have adopted. Representative Klein, I do have a few questions I'd like to ask you. Admittedly, they may be a little bit repetitive in nature to some of the other questions that you've already received. Representative Klein, could you explain why the Biden administration did not deport this illegal alien after he committed multiple crimes?
I thank the gentlelady for the question. There is no excuse for the Biden administration not arresting and deporting this illegal alien. But of course, the Biden administration does not want to enforce our immigration laws. For instance, under the Biden administration's immigration enforcement policies, as Secretary Mayorkas directed in September of 2021, ICE agents can't prioritize for arrest or other immigration enforcement action an alien unless the alien has committed a serious crime, however that is determined. This, of course, directly conflicts with current immigration law. I guess they prefer to wait to deport an illegal alien until after the alien commits a serious crime, including murder.
But even in the case of a Venezuelan immigrant that crossed the border illegally in July, had been arrested, I think, something like 14, he'd been arrested 6 times on 14 different charges after he crossed the border illegally in July. So we're really not even deporting people after they commit additional crimes, and we're letting them into the interior of the country without really any vetting, any tracking, any ability to know. With 1.7 million known gotaways, 7.5 million encounters, 169 individuals just in fiscal year 23 whose names appear on the terror watch list were stopped, 18 of those in September alone. Encounters have increased under the Biden administration 100% as compared to fiscal year 19. Representative Klein, can you explain how the Laken Riley Act addresses the situation of not deporting people committing crimes?
I thank the gentlelady for the question. The act would ensure that the administration's lax immigration enforcement policies would not apply to aliens who committed the same crimes that Laken's killer did. H.R. 7511 would require ICE to lodge a detainer and effectively and expeditiously take custody of aliens who commit theft offenses. The bill mandates ICE detention for such aliens until they can be removed from the country.
And should we, what should we expect when we have Biden administration policies like calling for the mass release of aliens? On September 13th and September 15th, mass street releases of aliens were conducted due to CBP facilities being over capacity. CBP released 13,000 aliens in San Diego over that month alone. On September 14th, in Arizona, their facilities were over capacity and they were forced to begin releasing aliens into the community. But we have laws on the books that require detaining, not letting illegal immigrants to cross into the country. The Biden administration is just not currently following the laws that are on the books. Is that your understanding?
It is my understanding, and the courts have upheld mandatory detention laws under our current laws.
Well, we should be all doing all we can to prevent other families from having to endure what the Riley family has had to endure. But this isn't the only time that this has happened. There have been instances, I think, of over 100 cases that Speaker Johnson has identified where something similar has happened. We certainly are grieving for those families as well. Can you speak to the provision in this bill that would give the states the ability to sue the federal government on behalf of their constituents in cases where the federal government, as they're doing now, is failing to secure the border?
Absolutely. As you stated, the administration released Laken Riley's alleged killer into the United States in 2022 through its violations of the parole and detention requirements under federal immigration law. Although H.R. 2, as passed by the House, would ensure that the administration could not exploit the law in this way, the Laken Riley Act adds another safeguard to help ensure the immigration laws are followed by providing states standing to bring a civil action against federal officials for the failure to enforce the 5 most abused immigration statutes, including mandatory detention requirements at its southwest border, individual parole authority that is limited to case-by-case determinations, and visa sanctions against countries that refuse to accept the return of their nationals. In doing so, the bill responds to the Supreme Court's ruling just last year in United States versus Texas, in which the court held that states did not have standing to challenge the Biden administration's lax immigration enforcement policies.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that provision is so important because every state now is a border state, and I certainly thank the state of Texas for their efforts in trying to secure the border. My own state, Indiana, has just deployed the National Guard to the southern border to be of service and help there. I do think that that provision is particularly important, and I'm glad to see it included in this legislation. In the face of bad policy and action by Joe Biden, the failure of this administration, I think states should have the ability to hold the federal government accountable. Accountability is fundamental to earning the public trust. We plan to give the American people that accountability mechanism in this legislation. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. For the sake of time, I'm just going to yield back. Thank you.
Yeah, your gesture is much appreciated. Gentleman from New York is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address some of the claims made by my colleagues on the other side of the dais here today, that Republicans are not serious about border security and that we won't provide more funding to secure our nation's borders. I'd like to refer to fiscal year 2024 Homeland Security Appropriations Bill that the House Republicans passed in spite of significant Democrat opposition that did in fact fund our nation's border security. There have been claims that we are not interested in providing the resources needed by those working on the front lines of our border. That is simply false. Our legislation we passed would provide $496 million for 22,000 Border Patrol agents, the highest level ever funded. The bill goes on to restore funding for border security technology from previous cuts by past Congresses and provides the highest level in funding ever for ICE's custody and detention operations. Misinformation aside, the facts of why we are here remain. A young woman lost her life because an illegal alien was given a one-way ticket to New York City by the Biden administration, rather than be detained at the border. Now, following an arrest, he was later released back onto the streets because of New York State's dangerous and deadly bail reform laws. The failed policies of the Biden administration allowed the alleged murderer to enter our country illegally. The failed policies of blue states, in the case of my own home state of New York, allowed this alleged murderer to skip town after being released from jail and ultimately taking the life of this young woman. It is nothing but cynical to place the cause of this tragedy on anything else but the failed and destructive policies of the radical left. Thank you, Representative Klein, and to the House Judiciary Committee for bringing this legislation forward today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of our witnesses for appearing today, and you gentlemen are excused.